You remember the rupee-ruble trade. It was all over the news last year. Russia and India would trade in local currencies. They would remove the US dollar from the equation. At least that was the plan. By May this year, the idea was dropped. It just wasn't practical enough. But now there is even worse news. Instead of local currencies, India could be paying in the Chinese currency, the yuan. Take a look at this report. It doesn't have official confirmation, but it does quote sources dealing closely with the trade. And what are they saying? Indian refiners are buying Russian oil with yuan. Indian oil became the first to do so in the month of June. At least 2 private refiners have also done it. We don't know which ones these are. We also don't know how much Russian oil they have bought. What we do know is this: it's not ideal. In March, the Indian government had warned precisely against this. Don't use the yuan for oil trade. And the reason is quite simple. China is trying to internationalize the yuan to challenge the US dollar. Why should India help China achieve that goal? Which is why there was emphasis on the rupee-ruble trade. But once that fell through, the yuan stepped in. How much money are we talking about here? Probably millions. Indian oil has used yuan for multiple cargoes, and the oil trade is only booming. In August last year, India imported around 730,000 barrels per day from Russia. In June this year, it hit 2 million barrels per day. Russia now makes up 42% of India's crude imports. Now, this has been both good and bad news. Good news because we got cheaper oil, and that's one reason why India's inflation is under control. The bad news is payments are getting tough. You can't use dollars or euros anymore. Russia has been booted out of all Western banking systems. Technically, India doesn't impose those sanctions. But Indian banks are wary because many of them have businesses abroad. So they're trying to keep their hands clean. And how are they doing that? By taking payments in other currencies. Reports say a lot of trade is happening in the UAE dirham, and since June in the Chinese yuan. But why not the Indian rupee? That was the whole point of the rupee-ruble trade. So why not use the Indian currency? To understand that, we must look at the nature of Russia-India trade. It is booming, but it's mostly one way. India's trade deficit with Russia is $34 billion. And what does that mean? It means we are buying a lot more than we are selling to the Russians. Assume both countries use local currencies for this trade. Then what would happen? Russia would get a lot of Indian rupees, but they would not have much to buy with it. Reports say they would have a rupee surplus worth $40 billion, 40 billion every year. And that's a pile of unusable cash. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why not convert that rupee into rubles and take it home? Well, that's the second problem. You see, the Indian rupee is only partially convertible. There are restrictions on converting large amounts. In fact, the yuan is the same. Even the Chinese currency is not fully convertible. But there is a key difference. China's trade deficit with Russia is just $3 billion. China's exports to Russia were up 19% at the beginning of this year. So Russia can use the yuan, but right now it cannot use the Indian rupee as much. Like I said, this is not an ideal situation. The Indian government doesn't like it. I'm sure the Indian banks and refiners don't like it either. So what's the way out? Well, one option is to make the rupee fully convertible. Several experts have been calling for that change. But such a decision could also backfire because fully convertible currencies cannot be controlled by the central bank. It's all about market forces then. And that means a lot of volatility in the currency market, which is never good news for developing nations. The second option is to make the rupee more desirable. And how do you do that? By closing the trade deficit, by exporting more things to Russia. And it's easier said than done. But in the last couple of months, we have made some progress. India's Commerce Ministry is already on the job. It has asked exporters to identify additional products that can be sold to Russia. Right now, most of the trade is engineering goods, medicines, chemicals. The plan is to expand that. February 2023 was a good month. India's exports to Russia rose by 25%. They reached the levels before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Engineering goods are leading the way. The export of those items jumped 11 times in April this year. The same month, an Indian trade delegation also landed in Moscow, and their focus was agricultural trade. India's agro exports to Russia are at $750 million. The target is to hit $3 billion in the next 3 years. Ambitious but necessary. And this is the best course of action for India, to cut down the deficit, to make the rupee more desirable, because depending on the yuan is not a long-term solution. A, we have political issues with China, and B, it would undercut the rupee's global ambitions. So the solution is simple, at least on paper: produce more and export more. But these things don't happen overnight. It will take years of policy nudges and investment. So it's the direction and the intent that matters.